On a Saturday morning in March of 1983, at the Bremer County Equipment Liquidation Auction in Waverly, Iowa, Sarah Mitchell raised her hand. 51 years old farmer widow, the kind of woman who didn't speak unless she had something worth saying. Her hand went up, $8,700 for the entire remaining lot. 32 tractors and implements that no one in the room had wanted to buy individually. The auctioneer had been trying to sell them one at a time since 9 that morning. A rusted Farmall H with a seized engine number takers. An Alice Chalmers WD-45 missing its rear tires, no takers. An Oliver 77 with a cracked manifold and a bird's nest in the air cleaner housing. Someone offered $40 as a joke and withdrew it when nobody laughed. By 11:30, the auctioneer had moved 19 machines and sold exactly 3 of them for a combined total of $940. The remaining 32 sat in the back rows of the lot like a congregation no one had come to visit. Sarah's hand went up, $8,700 for all of them, everything still sitting on the gravel. The room did what rooms do when a woman says something that doesn't fit the arithmetic. It laughed, not cruel or not entirely cruel. It was the laughter of practical men who understood equipment values and scrap metal prices and the distance between the two. Watching a woman offer real money for machines that most of them wouldn't have hauled home for free. Marcus Brennan was sitting in the second row. Marcus owned Brennan Farm and Implement on Route 218 just south of Waverly, the largest equipment dealership in Bremer County. He had been selling new tractors and combines to local farmers for 19 years. 47 years old, clean-shaven white shirt tucked into pressed khakis and a pair of leather shoes that had never touched a plowed field. His hands were soft. His Ford pickup in the parking lot was brand new, a company truck with the Brennan logo on both doors in green and gold. He turned around in his metal folding chair and looked at Sarah with the particular expression of a man who believes he is witnessing a mistake and wants to make sure everyone else sees it too. Loud enough that the people in the rows behind him heard it clearly. Someone ought to ask her if she plans to fix them with a hairpin and a prayer book. The men around him laughed, the kind of laughter that moves through a room of farmers like wind through corn. Sarah heard it. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the auctioneer. She had heard men laugh at her before. When she was 16 and told her father she wanted to learn engines instead of cooking. When she was 23 and married James Mitchell and told people she would keep working the farm alongside him. When she was 38 and rebuilt the transmission on their international harvester, while James held the light and asked her questions he should have known the answers to. The laughter didn't bother her anymore. It was just noise, like rain on a tin roof. You could let it keep you awake or you could learn to sleep through it. Paul Dietrich was a heavy-set man who had been calling farm sales in northeast Iowa for 26 years. He looked at Sarah over the rim of his bifocals. "Mrs. Mitchell, you're bidding $8,700 for the entire remaining lot. 32 units. That's the bid." Sarah nodded once. "That's the bid." Paul waited. He scanned the room the way auctioneers scan rooms, looking for a twitch, a raised finger, a shift in posture that might signal a counter. Nobody moved. Nobody raised a card. The 32 machines sat on the gravel in 3 uneven rows, rust-colored and quiet. Their paint faded to the kind of dull red and orange and green that old equipment turns when it has been sitting outside for years without attention. Paul brought the gavel down, sold 32 units to Sarah Mitchell for $8,700. Nobody in that auction room understood what Sarah Mitchell had just purchased, because to understand what she had done, you had to understand where she had learned to do it. And that meant going back to a workshop built in 1958, and it meant going back further than that to a girl who learned to listen before she learned to speak. Frank Mitchell, Sarah's father, born 1920, farmed 180 acres of rolling ground east of Waverly that produced good corn in wet years and decent corn in dry ones, and just enough income to keep a family fed and a mortgage paid if the man running it was careful. Frank had been careful in the way that a specific generation of Iowa farmers understood the word. Careful did not mean timid. Careful meant aware. Aware of what the land needed, aware of what the equipment needed, aware of what the bank wanted versus what the bank deserved to get. Frank had farmed with a Farmall H he bought used in 1952 and a two-bottom plow he rebuilt himself from parts he collected over 3 winters. He never bought a new machine in his life, not because he couldn't afford to, though the margins were always thin, but because he believed that buying new equipment was a way of paying someone else for knowledge you should have acquired yourself. The shop behind the barn was Frank's real investment. He had built it in 1958, a concrete floor building with a wood stove and a workbench that ran the full length of the east wall. Over 30 years, he had filled it with tools, not expensive tools, not match sets from a catalog, but the accumulation of a working life. Wrenches inherited from his own father. Socket sets bought at farm sales for pennies on the dollar. A valve spring compressor he had fabricated from angle iron and a truck spring. A timing light he repaired twice rather than replace. Sarah had been born in 1932, the middle child. David came first in 1928, then Sarah, then her younger sister Catherine in 1935. Catherine died of scarlet fever in 1937, 2 years old. Sarah was 5 when it happened, old enough to remember, old enough to understand that her mother's grief was the kind that doesn't heal. It just changes shape. Sarah's mother, Margaret, had grown up in Cedar Rapids, the daughter of a banker. She had married Frank in 1927 against her father's wishes. Her father thought Frank was beneath her, a farmer, dirt under his fingernails. No college education, no prospects beyond 180 acres of Iowa dirt. Margaret proved her father wrong by loving Frank fiercely and learning to farm alongside him. She drove the tractor during planting. She kept the books. She canned vegetables and raised chickens and made the farm work when the margins were thin enough that one mistake would have ended everything. After Catherine died, something in Margaret broke. Not all at once, slowly, like a bearing wearing out over years of use. She still did the work, still kept the books, still canned the vegetables, but the light went out of her eyes. And by the time Sarah was 14, the cancer that would kill Margaret was already growing inside her. Sarah learned to take apart a carburetor before she learned to drive. By the time she was 12, she could diagnose a misfire by sound alone. Her father would start an engine and Sarah would stand beside it with her eyes closed, listening, and Frank would ask her what she heard. Too rich, listen closer. Valve lash off on number 3. Good. What else? Timing about 2 degrees advanced. Frank would nod and shut off the engine. Then he would show her how to fix it. Not tell her. Show her. His hands on the tools, moving with the practiced economy of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Then her hands on the tools, moving slower, more carefully, learning the weight and balance and proper angle of approach. It was a language Frank taught the way other fathers taught their sons to fish or hunt. Patient repetition until the knowledge lived in the hands and the ears and not just the head. He used to say something that Sarah carried with her the way other people carried pocket knives or photographs. Every broken machine is just a conversation you haven't finished yet. You listen long enough, it tells you what it needs. Sarah remembered the first time she heard her father say that. She was 11 years old. They were in the shop working on a neighbor's hay baler. The baler had been making a grinding noise. The neighbor, Vernon Thatcher, had brought it over on a Saturday morning and explained the problem. Sounds like it's chewing gravel, Frank. Can't figure it out. Frank and Sarah had spent 2 hours tearing down the baler's plunger assembly. They found the problem eventually. A bearing race had cracked. Metal shavings had contaminated the grease. The grinding noise was the bearing destroying itself. Frank showed Sarah the broken race. He held it up to the light so she could see the crack. See that crack didn't happen yesterday? That's been growing for months. The machine's been trying to tell Vernon something's wrong. But Vernon didn't listen. He kept running it. Now instead of a $15 bearing, he needs a whole new assembly. $150 lesson. Frank set down the race and looked at Sarah. Every broken machine is just a conversation you haven't finished yet. You listen long enough, it tells you what it needs. Most people don't listen. They run equipment till it breaks, then they call it bad luck. But it's not luck. It's not listening. Sarah never forgot that. Not when she was 11, not when she was 30, not when she was 51, standing in an auction yard with her hand up bidding on 32 machines that everyone else had stopped listening to. Sarah's mother died when Sarah was 14. Cancer. The quiet kind that doesn't announce itself until it's too late to do anything but watch. Margaret spent the last 6 months in bed. Sarah took care of her, changed her bed sheets, helped her to the bathroom, spooned soup into her mouth when Margaret was too weak to hold the spoon herself. The day Margaret died was a Tuesday in November. Cold, the first hard freeze of the season. Sarah had come in from morning chores and found her mother in bed, not breathing. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, then she walked downstairs and told her father. Frank went upstairs alone. He stayed up there for an hour. When he came down, his eyes were red, but his face was composed. He made 2 phone calls, one to the funeral home in Waverly, one to David in Cedar Rapids. Then he put on his coat and went out to the shop. Sarah followed him. She didn't know what else to do. Her mother was upstairs dead, and her father was in the shop, standing at the workbench, with his hands flat on the wood surface, just standing there, not moving. Sarah stood in the doorway and waited. After a while, Frank spoke without turning around. Your mother wanted you to have her mother's ring. It's in the jewelry box on her dresser. She told me last week to make sure you got it. Sarah didn't say anything. She also wanted you to know that she was proud of you, that you're stronger than she ever was, that you're going to be fine. Frank's voice cracked on that last word. He put his hands over his face. His shoulders shook. Sarah had never seen her father cry. She walked over and put her arms around him and held him while he broke. After Margaret died, it was just Sarah and Frank and the farm and the shop. David had moved to Cedar Rapids for college in 1946 and never came back except for holidays. He had become an accountant. He married a woman from Dubuque named Patricia. He wore ties to work and his hands stayed clean. David tried to get Sarah to move to Cedar Rapids after their mother died. You could go to college, Sarah, get a degree, meet people. You're 14 years old. You shouldn't be stuck on a farm taking care of Dad. Sarah looked at her brother like he had suggested she cut off her own arm. I'm not stuck. This is where I want to be. David didn't understand. He had always seen the farm as something to escape from. Sarah saw it as the only place that made sense. She stayed, not because Frank asked her to. He never asked. But because the farm was the only language she spoke fluently, and the shop was the only place she felt like herself. She learned to rebuild engines the way other girls learned to sew. She learned to read bearing wear patterns the way other girls read fashion magazines. By the time she was 18, she could tear down and reassemble a Farmall M faster than most mechanics twice her age. The boys at school didn't know what to make of her. Sarah Mitchell, The girl who smelled like diesel fuel and had grease under her fingernails, who could talk about compression ratios and valve timing, but couldn't talk about dances or movies or any of the things normal girls talked about. The girls thought she was strange. Some of them were cruel about it. Sarah didn't particularly care. She had work to do. She graduated high school in 1950, turned down a scholarship to Iowa State. Her teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had pushed her to apply. "You're smart enough, Sarah. You could study agricultural engineering. Be one of the first women in the program." Sarah had considered it for about 10 seconds. Then she thought about leaving her father alone on the farm, thought about leaving the shop, thought about sitting in classrooms learning theory from professors who had never rebuilt an engine with their own hands. "No, thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I'm needed here." Frank never asked her to stay, but Sarah saw the relief in his eyes when she told him she wasn't going to Iowa State. "You sure about this, Sarah? You're smart. You could do anything." "I am doing what I want to do, Dad." And that was the end of that conversation. Sarah farmed alongside her father for 9 years. She learned every field, every fence line, every low spot that would flood in a heavy rain. She learned which hybrid corn grew best in which field. She learned how to read the soil by touch. She learned when to plant and when to wait. She learned that farming was not just a job, it was a way of reading the world. She met James Mitchell in 1959. James was from town, son of Harold Mitchell, who owned the hardware store on Main Street in Waverly. James had taken a job at the co-op after high school. He was 24 when Sarah met him. She was 27. They met at a church social in May. James was serving punch. Sarah had only come because her father had asked her to. Frank thought Sarah needed to get out more, meet people her own age. Sarah thought church socials were a waste of time, but she went because her father asked. James poured her a cup of punch and tried to make conversation. "I'm James Mitchell, Sarah Mitchell, no relation." James smiled. "That's good. Would be awkward if we were cousins." Sarah didn't smile back. She wasn't good at small talk. "You work at the co-op, right? I do. You're Frank Mitchell's daughter. I've seen you come in with your dad." Sarah nodded, took a sip of punch. It was too sweet. James tried again. "I heard you know more about tractors than most of the mechanics in the county." "Who told you that?" "Your dad. He was in last week buying seed. He was telling Vernon about how you rebuilt the transmission on your farmall." Vernon didn't believe him, said women don't do transmission work. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. "What did my father say?" "He said you'd be happy to show Vernon the transmission if Vernon wanted to drive out and see it." Sarah almost smiled. That sounded like Frank. James was still talking. "I told Vernon he was an idiot. I said if Frank Mitchell says his daughter rebuilt a transmission, then she rebuilt a transmission. Frank Mitchell doesn't lie about anything, least of all his daughter." Sarah looked at James Mitchell for the first time, really looked at him. He had kind eyes, and he had just defended her to Vernon Thatcher without even knowing her. "Thank you for that." James shrugged. "I just told the truth." They talked for another 20 minutes. James asked her about farming. Sarah found herself explaining crop rotation and soil management and the difference between chisel plowing and moldboard plowing. James listened like he actually cared, asked questions that weren't stupid, seemed genuinely interested. When Sarah left that evening, James asked if he could call on her sometime. Sarah said yes. James courted her the way men courted women in those days. Dinners at the cafe in Waverly, drives through the countryside on Sunday afternoons. He asked her to marry him in the spring of 1959, and Sarah said yes because James was kind and steady and didn't seem bothered by the fact that she knew more about tractors than he did. They were married in June. Small ceremony. Methodist church. Maybe 50 people. James moved into the farmhouse with Sarah and Frank. The arrangement worked because James understood that Frank Mitchell's operation was not going to change just because his daughter had gotten married. James learned to farm the way Sarah had learned to farm, by doing, by watching, by making mistakes and fixing them. He was never as good with equipment as Sarah was. His hands were too uncertain. He could change oil and grease fittings and replace a belt, but anything more complicated than that, and he would defer to Sarah. She didn't mind. Everyone had their strengths. James was good with people, good at negotiating grain prices, good at remembering names and birthdays, and which neighbor needed help bringing in hay. Their daughter Emma was born in 1964. The pregnancy was difficult. Sarah had morning sickness that lasted all day. She kept working through it, kept fixing equipment, kept doing chores. At 7 months pregnant, she was still climbing up on tractors. Frank finally put his foot down. Sarah, you're going to hurt yourself. Let James and me handle the equipment work till after the baby comes. Sarah didn't like it, but she listened. Emma was born in August. The delivery was bad, 36 hours of labor. The doctor finally used forceps. Emma came out screaming. Sarah hemorrhaged, lost enough blood that the doctor told her afterward there wouldn't be any more children. Sarah took the news the same way she took most news, quietly, with her jaw set and her eyes focused on the middle distance. James wanted more children. Sarah knew that, but James never complained. He poured all his love into Emma, taught her to count, taught her to read, taught her all the things fathers teach daughters when they only get one chance. Emma grew up the way Sarah had grown up, on the farm, around machines, learning by proximity. But Emma was different. Where Sarah had been curious about engines, Emma was curious about numbers. Where Sarah had wanted to know how things worked, Emma wanted to know what things cost. By the time Emma was 10, she was keeping a ledger of farm expenses in a spiral notebook. Seed costs, fuel costs, repair costs. She would sit at the kitchen table after dinner and write everything down in careful columns. Sarah watched her daughter fill page after page with figures and saw a mind that worked differently from her own. Emma was smart. Everyone said so. Teachers, neighbors, the pastor at church. She made straight A's. She read books that Sarah had never heard of. She talked about college the way other kids talked about summer vacation. Something inevitable. Something assumed. Frank died when Emma was 12, spring of 1976. Heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in the shop with a half-disassembled water pump on the bench and his reading glasses folded neatly beside it. 71 years old. Sarah found him at 8:30. She had come out to ask him something about the planning schedule. She opened the shop door and saw him slumped over the workbench and knew before she crossed the threshold that he was gone. She stood beside him for a long moment, put her hand on his shoulder. His body was still warm but getting cold. She picked up his reading glasses and folded them the rest of the way, set them beside the water pump. Then she walked back to the house and called the doctor. The funeral was on a Thursday, small service, Methodist church in Waverly, maybe 40 people. Sarah sat in the front pew with James and Emma and did not cry because crying was something you did in private, not in front of people who were watching to see if you were strong enough to keep the farm running by yourself. After the service, Marcus Brennan's father, old Samuel Brennan, came up to her. Samuel had run the dealership before Marcus took over. He was 73 years old, stooped, liver spots on his hands. Sarah, I'm sorry about Frank. He was a good man. Thank you, Mr. Brennan. Samuel hesitated. Then he said what he had come to say. If you're thinking about selling the farm, I know some people who'd be interested. Good price. You could move into town, get a regular job, wouldn't have to work so hard. Sarah looked at him. I'm not selling. Samuel nodded slowly. Well, if you change your mind, it's a lot of work for a woman with just her husband. Sarah didn't respond. She turned and walked to her truck and drove home. That night, she sat in the shop with the lights off and the wood stove cold and thought about what Samuel Brennan had said. A lot of work for a woman with just her husband. He was right. It was a lot of work. 180 acres to manage, equipment to maintain, crops to plant and harvest, books to keep, decisions to make. But Sarah had been making those decisions alongside her father since she was 16. She knew every field. She knew every machine. She knew how much fuel the farmall burned per acre and how many bushels the old John Deere combine could handle before the cylinder needed adjusting, and exactly when in September the corn in the bottom 40 would be dry enough to pick. She knew the farm. The farm knew her. That was enough. Frank left Sarah the farm, the shop, the tools, and no debt, zero. Not a dollar owed to any bank or any man in Bremer County in 1976. That was not common. By 1976, most farmers in Iowa carried some amount of debt, equipment loans, operating lines, land mortgages. The agriculture economy was beginning to shift. The old model, the one Frank had lived by used fix it yourself, pay cash, stay small, was being replaced by a new model. Finance new, expand, leverage, grow or die. That was the wisdom Marcus Brennan preached from his dealership on Route 218. New equipment was more efficient, more reliable, easier to operate. And if you financed it through the dealership at reasonable rates, the increased productivity would more than pay for itself. The math seemed sound, and for a while it was. Through the late 70s, commodity prices climbed. Corn hit $3 a bushel. Land values soared. Farmers who had borrowed money to expand were making money, lots of it. Sarah watched it happen, watched neighbors buy new John Deeres and Internationals, watched them add acreage, watched them build new machine sheds and grain bins, watched them talk at the co-op about their operations like they were running corporations instead of farms. James wanted to expand too. In 1979, he came to Sarah with a proposal. Corn's at $3, Sarah. Land values are up. The Henderson place next door is for sale. 80 acres. Good ground. We could buy it, finance it with the bank, use the equity in our place as collateral. Sarah listened. Then she asked the question that mattered. What happens if corn drops to $2? James had an answer. He had thought this through. Then we tighten our belts for a year. But corn's not going to drop. Demand is strong. Exports are up. We've got a good 10-year run ahead of us. Sarah wasn't convinced. She had watched commodity markets long enough to know that what goes up always comes down. The only question was when. But James wanted it, and Sarah loved her husband, so she said yes. James borrowed $15,000 against the farm in 1979. He put $5,000 down on the Henderson 80 acres and used the rest for equipment, upgrades, and operating expenses. The loan was from Regional Farm Credit, $15,000 principal, 18% interest compounded quarterly. Monthly payment, $412. James made the first payment in February 1980. He made the second payment in March. He made the third payment in April. And then everything changed. Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve raised the prime interest rate to 21.5% to break inflation. Farm operating loans that had been manageable at 8% became suffocating at 18% overnight. Foreign demand collapsed. Corn dropped below 250. Land values that had been climbing for a decade reversed and began a fall that would not stop until Iowa farmland had lost 63% of its peak value. James panicked. Sarah watched it happen, watched her husband go from confident to anxious to desperate in the span of 6 months. The Henderson deal fell through. The seller backed out when land values started dropping. James lost the $5,000 down payment. The bank still wanted the $15,000 back, with interest. James stopped sleeping. He would lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling. Sarah would reach over and put her hand on his chest and feel his heart hammering. "We're going to be okay, James. How are we going to be okay? We owe $16,000, Sarah. Corn's at 230. We can't make the payment and cover operating expenses. The math doesn't work. Then we'll make it work." But Sarah didn't know how. Not yet. James died in the spring of 1981. Tractor rolled on a slope he should not have been working. He had been trying to terrace the South 40, trying to increase yields, trying to make up for the money they were losing on the loan. Sarah had been at the co-op buying seed. She came home and saw the International sitting at an angle with one wheel in the air and knew before she got close. James was underneath, crushed, dead before Sarah arrived, maybe dead before the tractor stopped rolling. Sarah knelt beside him, put her hand on his face. His skin was still warm. She stayed there for a long time. Then she walked back to the house and called the sheriff. The funeral was larger than Frank's had been. James had been well liked. The church was full. People Sarah barely knew came up and offered condolences. She accepted them the way you accept rain. There was no stopping it. You just waited for it to pass. Emma was 17, a junior in high school. She sat beside her mother during the service and did not cry either. After it was over, after everyone had gone home and the casseroles had been put in the refrigerator and the house was quiet again, Emma came into the kitchen where Sarah was washing dishes. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Sarah kept washing. "We'll be okay." "How do you know?" "Because we don't have a choice." Emma didn't say anything else. She picked up a towel and started drying. After James died, Sarah discovered the loan papers in his desk drawer. She sat at the kitchen table and read through them twice. 15,000 principal, 18% interest compounded quarterly. Currently 3 months in arrears. Total amount due with penalties, $16,200. Sarah did not panic. Panic was not useful. She did the arithmetic. The farm's annual net income averaged about $18,000 in good years, $12,000 in bad years. The loan payment was $412 monthly, almost $5,000 annually. That left $13,000 to cover property taxes, seed fuel equipment, maintenance insurance, living expenses. The numbers did not work. Gerald Hartfield from Regional Farm Credit came to the house 6 weeks after the funeral. 55 years old, gray suit, briefcase, sympathetic smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm very sorry for your loss. We need to discuss the outstanding loan." Sarah sat across from him at the kitchen table. David, her older brother, sat beside her. David was a CPA in Cedar Rapids, 53 years old, successful. He had driven out when Sarah called. Gerald laid out the terms, everything Sarah had already read in the papers. Then he laid out the bank's position. "If you cannot maintain the payment schedule, Mrs. Mitchell, the bank will have no choice but to initiate foreclosure proceedings. We would prefer to work with you. But the loan must be serviced." Sarah looked at the papers. She looked at Gerald Hartfield. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. How long do I have? Realistically, 18 months before we would need to move forward with action. Gerald paused, shifted in his chair, then delivered the line he had practiced in the car on the drive over. Mrs. Mitchell, have you considered selling? Land values are still reasonable in this area. You could clear the debt and have something left over. Start fresh somewhere else. Maybe move to town. Get a job that doesn't require this kind of physical labor. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. Start fresh somewhere else. As if the farm were just an asset. As if the 180 acres her father had worked for 50 years were interchangeable with any other 180 acres in any other county. As if the shop Frank built in 1958 were just a building. As if the tools he had collected over 30 years were just tools. As if the knowledge Sarah had learned in that shop could be packed up and moved somewhere else like furniture. Sarah stood up. Thank you for coming out, Mr. Hartfield. I'll be in touch. Gerald left. David stayed. He sat at the table with the loan papers spread in front of him and did the arithmetic that accountants do. He filled 2 pages of his legal pad with numbers. Then he set down his pen and looked at his sister. Sarah, the numbers don't work. Even if you have a perfect crop year, even if corn hits $3, you can't service this debt and keep the farm operational. You're going to have to sell. Sarah was standing at the window looking at the shop her father built. The June afternoon light was coming through the windows at an angle that made the dust motes visible in the air. She could see the outline of the farm all through the open door, the workbench along the east wall, the wood stove in the corner. I'm not selling. David's voice was gentle, the way you talk to someone who's in denial. Sarah, I know what this place means to you, but you have to be realistic. You can't pay this debt. You can't farm 180 acres alone. You can't maintain the equipment. You can't do everything James and Dad did. It's too much. Sarah turned from the window. She looked at her brother. David was 53 years old. He had left the farm 25 years ago and never looked back. He had built a good life in Cedar Rapids. Clean hands, steady income, a pension waiting for him in 12 years. He understood numbers, but he did not understand the farm. He did not understand that some things could not be reduced to columns in a ledger. Then what are you going to do? Sarah did not answer right away. She thought about her father's hands. She thought about the tools in the shop. She thought about the notebook she had found after Frank died. The one where he kept repair records and wrote in the margins things he wanted to remember. She thought about a sentence Frank had written on the inside back cover. Sarah had read it a dozen times since finding it. She had memorized it without trying. Don't count what you've spent. Count what you saved someone else from spending. At the time, Sarah hadn't understood what it meant. Now sitting at the kitchen table with her brother, telling her the numbers didn't work, and the bank telling her she had 18 months before foreclosure, she began to understand. I'm going to do what Dad did. I'm going to fix things. David looked at his sister. Sarah, you can't fix your way out of $15,000 of debt. Sarah turned from the window. Watch me. That conversation happened in June of 1981. Sarah spent the rest of that summer thinking, planning, trying to find a way forward that didn't end with losing the farm. She made the loan payment in July, $412. It hurt. After making the payment, her checking account had $300 in it. Planting was done. The corn was growing, but harvest was 3 months away, and she needed fuel and parts and a dozen other things between now and then. She made the payment in August, $412, $250 left in the account. She made the payment in September, $412, $100 left. The corn came in well that year. 115 bushels per acre on the home farm. Good but not great, Sarah sold it for $2.40 a bushel. After expenses, she netted $14,000 for the year. She paid off the arrears on the loan, caught up, started the new year current. But she was still bleeding. Every month, $412 went to Gerald Hartfield. Every month, Sarah's margin got thinner. By the spring of 1982, Sarah knew she needed another source of income. Farming alone wasn't going to cut it. She needed something else. Something that used the skills she had. Something that didn't require borrowing money or buying new equipment. She started attending farm auctions. Not to buy, just to watch. To see what sold and what didn't. To see what farmers needed. What she saw was a county full of farmers in the same position she was in, struggling with debt, unable to afford new equipment, unable to get credit for used equipment, desperate for anything that would keep them farming one more year. And she saw rows of old equipment, Farmalls and Olivers and Alice Chalmers machines from the 40s and 50s, sitting at auctions, not selling, or selling for scrap prices, $50, $75, $100 for a tractor that would have cost $3,000 new. Nobody wanted them. They were obsolete. Parts were hard to find. They didn't have the horsepower or the features of modern equipment. They were, as Marcus Brennan said repeatedly, at the Waverly Cafe scrap metal with paint on them. But Sarah saw something else. She saw machines that could be fixed, engines that could be rebuilt, transmissions that could be overhauled, hydraulics that could be restored. She saw $1,100 tractors that could do the work of $32,000 tractors if someone was willing to fix them. And she saw farmers who needed $1,100 tractors because they couldn't get financing for $32,000 tractors. That was the gap. That was the opportunity. Sarah started small. In the fall of 1982, she bought a manure spreader at an auction for $40. It had a broken chain drive. She brought it home, spent 3 evenings in the shop, replaced the chain, greased the bearings, tested it, sold it to Vernon Thatcher for $120, $80 profit. 3 evenings of work. Vernon was happy. He had been looking for a manure spreader but couldn't afford the $800 the dealership wanted for a used one. Sarah's spreader worked just as well, and Vernon paid TC. Sarah did it again. Bought a hay baler for $60, fixed it, sold it for $150, $90 profit. Then again, cultivator, $75, fixed, sold for $160, $85 profit. By the spring of 1983, Sarah had made an extra $800 fixing and selling equipment. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make the difference between making the loan payment and missing it. And then she heard about the Bremer County Equipment Liquidation Auction, a dealership in Waverly going under. Selling off inventory, Sarah drove by the lot the week before the auction, saw rows of equipment, new stuff up front, old stuff in back. She walked the back rows, looked at the old stuff, 32 units, Farmalls, Olivers, Alice Chalmers, Fords, all of them broken, all of them ignored. Sarah stood in that lot and did the arithmetic. 32 machines, if she could fix half of them, if she could sell them for $1,100 each. That was over $17,000 gross, minus parts costs, maybe $3,000 or $4,000. That left $13,000 profit. $13,000 would pay off the loan, would give her breathing room, would save the farm, but it required buying all 32 machines. It required spending money she didn't have. It required betting everything on her ability to fix machines that might not be fixable. Sarah went home. opened the ledger where she and James had been saving for a new combine. $8,700. Every dollar they had set aside since 1979. She sat at the kitchen table and thought about her father, thought about 1956, thought about Frank buying broken equipment and fixing it and selling it and saving the farm. She thought about the sentence in his notebook. Don't count what you've spent. Count what you saved someone else from spending. Sarah closed the ledger, made her decision, Saturday morning, March 1983, Bremer County Equipment Liquidation Auction. Sarah raised her hand. $8,700 for the entire remaining lot. And the room laughed. But Sarah didn't hear them anymore. She was already thinking about the shop, about the tools, about the 32 conversations she was about to begin. The laughter didn't matter. What mattered was the work, and the work was about to start. Sarah drove home from the auction with the purchase receipt on the seat beside her. $8,700, 32 units. As is, no warranty, no guarantee, just her word that she would haul them away within 1 week. She pulled into the driveway and sat in the truck for a long moment before going inside. The March afternoon was cold. The sky was the color of old pewter. The fields were empty. Planting was still 6 weeks away. Sarah went into the house, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, opened the ledger, wrote in the careful handwriting she had learned in a one-room schoolhouse 40 years earlier. March 12, 1983, Bremer County Auction. 32 units equipment, $8,700. She closed the ledger, put it back in the drawer, looked out the window at the March sky, which promised nothing. Then she picked up the phone, called David. I did it. Did what? Bought the tractors, 32 of them, $8,700. David was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Sarah, please tell me you didn't spend the combine fund. I spent the combine fund. Another silence. Longer this time. I'm coming out there. You don't need to come out here. Sarah, you just spent every liquid dollar you have on scrap metal. I'm coming out there. He came out the next evening, Monday, pulled into the driveway, got out of his car, stood looking at Sarah for a long moment before speaking. Show me what you bought. Sarah hadn't hauled any of them home yet. She had borrowed Vernon Thatcher's flatbed trailer, but she hadn't made the first trip yet. She drove David back to the auction lot, showed him the 3 rows of machines still sitting on the gravel. David walked along the rows, looked at each machine, didn't touch them, just looked. Rust, broken parts, seized engines, missing components. When he got to the end, he turned around and walked back. Then he looked at Sarah. These are older than you are. I know, they're rusted. I know, do they run? Not yet. Can you fix them? I can fix most of them. David sat down on the running board of a farmall, put his head in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. Sarah, do you have any idea what Marcus Brennan is telling people? I can imagine. He's saying you've lost your mind. He's saying grief makes people do stupid things. He's saying you just lit $9,000 on fire. David's voice broke slightly on that last sentence. Sarah heard it and understood that her brother wasn't angry. He was scared. Scared that she was making a mistake that would cost her the farm. Scared that he would have to watch his sister lose everything their father had built. Sarah sat down on the running board beside him. She didn't say anything for a moment. The March wind was picking up, cold, coming from the north. Then she spoke quietly. David, do you remember 1956? David looked at her. What about it, the drought? Dad couldn't make the equipment payment to Samuel Brennan. Samuel came out to the farm 3 times trying to collect. Do you remember what Samuel told Dad the third time? David shook his head. He said Dad should sell the farm before the bank took it. Said Dad was too stubborn for his own good. Said holding on to a farm you can't afford to run is like drowning slowly instead of fast. Sarah paused, looked at the rows of rusted machines. Dad didn't sell. He bought broken equipment at auctions, fixed it, sold it, did that all summer. By fall, he had enough money to pay Samuel plus interest. David stared at his sister. I never knew that. Dad didn't talk about it, but he wrote it down in his notebook. I found it after he died. Sarah stood up, walked over to the nearest farmall, put her hand on the hood. The metal was cold, rust textured under her palm. These 32 machines are the same bet Dad made in 1956. That knowledge is worth more than money. That fixing is worth more than financing. That a farmer who owns a cheap tractor is better off than a farmer who finances an expensive one. She turned and looked at her brother. Marcus Brennan sells debt, David. I'm going to sell independence. We'll see which one farmers need more. David didn't say anything for a long time. Then he stood up, walked over to the farmall, looked at it the way he had looked at farm equipment when he was a boy, with curiosity, with a kind of respect he had forgotten he possessed. How long will it take to fix this one? 6 weeks, maybe 8. And you think you can sell it? I know I can sell it. For how much enough? David nodded slowly. Then he pulled out his wallet, took out $300 bills, handed them to Sarah. What's this? Parts money. Don't tell anyone I gave it to you. My wife thinks I'm paying for a hotel in Des Moines this weekend. Sarah looked at the money, then she looked at her brother. Thank you, don't thank me. Just prove Marcus Brennan wrong. It took 4 days to haul them home. Sarah borrowed Vernon's flatbed trailer and made 17 trips between the auction lot and her farm. 2 machines per load, driving slow because the trailer springs were old and the loads were heavy and the march roads in Bremer County were soft with thaw. Vernon helped with some of the loading, 68 years old, retired from active farming, but still keeping 40 acres just to stay busy. He had known Frank Mitchell for 40 years. Vernon didn't ask Sarah what she was planning to do with 32 broken tractors. He just helped her load them and chain them down and watched her drive away. On the 4th day, when Sarah was loading the last 2 machines, Vernon came over and stood beside the trailer. Your daddy would be proud of you, Sarah. Sarah looked at him. You think so, I know so. Frank Mitchell never took the easy road in his life. Neither are you. By Thursday evening, all 32 units were lined up in 3 rows behind the shop. Sarah stood at the kitchen window after dark and looked at them. The yard light illuminated the first row. The second and third rows disappeared into shadow. The machines looked like dinosaurs, ancient, obsolete, monuments to a way of farming that was supposed to be dead. Sarah thought about the money. $8,700. Gone. Converted into steel and rust and questions she didn't have answers to yet. She thought about Gerald Hartfield. The loan payment was due in 2 weeks, $412. She had it, barely. But after she made the payment, her checking account would have less than $200 in it. The spring planting was 6 weeks away. She needed seed, she needed fuel, she needed parts for her own equipment. The arithmetic was getting tight. Emma came home that weekend, 19 years old, freshman at the University of Iowa, studying business. She hadn't been home since Christmas. She pulled into the driveway Saturday morning, got out of her car, stood looking at the 3 rows of rusted tractors for a full minute before walking to the house. Sarah was in the shop. Emma found her there. standing beside a Farmall M with her hands on the hood, looking at it the way a surgeon looks at a patient before the first incision. Mom, what is all that? Sarah turned. Equipment. Emma walked deeper into the shop, looked at the tools laid out on the workbench, the socket set, the wrenches, the electrical tester, looked at her mother's hands already dark with grease. You bought all of those? I did. With what money? The combine fund. Emma's face went white. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. That was $9,000, 8,700. Mom, that was supposed to replace our equipment. That was supposed to keep us running for the next 10 years. It will. How Emma's voice was rising now. Sarah could hear the panic in it, the fear. Those tractors are older than I am. They're rusted out. They're broken. Half of them probably don't even have engines. Mom, Marcus Brennan told people at church last Sunday that you've lost your mind. Sarah wiped her hands on a rag. It was just something to do with her hands while she decided how to respond. Marcus Brennan sells $40,000 tractors to people who can't afford $400 payments. I'm not interested in Marcus Brennan's opinion. Emma's voice cracked. She was 19 years old and she was scared. Dad's been gone 2 years. Grandpa's been gone 7. You're alone out here trying to run this farm by yourself, and you just spent every dollar we had saved on junk. The word junk hit Sarah harder than she expected. Not because it was wrong. By most definitions, the 32 machines sitting behind the shop were junk, but because it came from Emma, her daughter, Frank's granddaughter. Sarah looked at her daughter. Emma was 19, smart, studying business at a good university. She understood spreadsheets and profit margins and return on investment. She understood everything except the thing that mattered most. These machines aren't junk, Emma. They're opportunity. For who? For people who need them. We need them. We need a combine that works. We need money for seed. We need to pay off Dad's loan before the bank takes the farm. We don't need 32 broken tractors. Sarah set down the rag, walked over to her daughter, put both hands on Emma's shoulders, looked her directly in the eyes. No, we need to not owe Gerald Hartfield $16,000. And the way we do that is not by buying a new combine we can't afford. It's by selling these tractors to farmers who can't afford what Marcus is selling. But they're broken. Now they are. They won't be when I'm done. How long is that going to take? Emma pulled away from her mother's hands. Her voice was breaking. How long, Mom? 6 months, a year, 2 years. And what happens to the farm while you're out here playing mechanic with Grandpa's tools? The word playing stung. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. I need you to trust me, Emma. I need you to be realistic. They stood facing each other in the shop, mother and daughter, 2 generations with 2 different ideas about what the farm needed. Outside, the March wind was picking up. Sarah could hear it rattling the shop door. Emma broke first, turned, walked toward the door, stopped when she got there, didn't turn around. I have to get back to Iowa City. I have an exam Monday. Drive safe. Emma left. Sarah stood in the shop and listened to her daughter's car start. Listened to it back out of the driveway. Listened to the sound fade down the county road until there was nothing left but the wind. Then she turned back to the Farmall M and got to work. The engine was seized. 4 pistons locked in 4 cylinders by 3 years of moisture and neglect, and the slow chemical patience of rust converting machine steel back into raw oxide. Sarah knew that unseizing a Farmall M engine was not complicated. It was slow. There was a difference between those 2 things, and the difference was where most people gave up. She pulled the head first. 16 bolts, each one requiring penetrating oil and a breaker bar in the particular kind of steady pressure that breaks a corroded fastener free without snapping it. 3 of the 16 bolts broke anyway. The heads sheared off clean, left the shanks in the block. Sarah didn't panic. This was expected. Old bolts break. You deal with it. She drilled them out using her father's drill press, started with a small bit, worked up to the right size, extracted the broken shanks with an easy out, retapped the holes with a temp and die set that had belonged to Frank's father. That was the first evening. 4 hours for 16 bolts. A man in a hurry would have looked at that rate of progress and calculated that the entire rebuild would take the rest of his natural life. Sarah was not in a hurry. She was not a man. She was a woman with 18 months before foreclosure and 32 machines that represented the only plan she had. With the head off, she could see the cylinders. The bores were rust-locked, a thin orange crust bonding piston to wall along the full circumference of each cylinder. She filled each bore with a mixture of diesel fuel and automatic transmission fluid, a penetrating solution her father had used for decades. Let them soak. 3 days. Every morning before chores, she checked the fluid level, topped it off. Every evening after chores, she tapped the tops of the pistons gently with a brass drift and a hammer, not trying to move them, just asking if they were ready. On the third evening, piston number 2 moved. Not much, a 16th of an inch, but it moved. Sarah felt something release in her chest, a tension she hadn't known she was carrying. The machine had answered. The conversation had begun. By the 5th evening, all 4 pistons were free. She pulled them, cleaned them, honed the cylinder walls with a ball hone mounted in her father's half-inch drill, worked each bore until the cross-hatch pattern was even and the rust was gone and the surface felt like glass under her fingertip. New piston rings ordered from a parts supplier in Waterloo cost $34. A new head gasket set cost $28. The rod bearings were worn beyond specification. A set of new bearings cost $12. The magneto needed rewinding. Sarah had watched her father rewind magnetos a dozen times, but she had never done it herself. That was when Ruth Calloway drove into Sarah's yard. Ruth Calloway was 78 years old. She had been the mechanic that half the farmers in Bremer County called when their equipment broke from 1938 until her retirement in 1974. Thin, white-haired, wearing coveralls that had been patched at both knees and a John Deere cap so faded the logo was more memory than print. Ruth had not been at the auction, but she had heard about Sarah's purchase from 4 different people in 3 days, and she had driven out to see for herself. Sarah found her standing in the first row of machines, both hands in her pockets, looking at the Farmall M that Sarah had pulled back outside after finishing the bottom end. Your father would have done the same thing. Ruth said it without turning around. Sarah stopped. She had not heard anyone drive up. She had been in the shop grinding a valve seat. Mrs. Calloway. Ruth turned. Don't Mrs. Calloway me, Sarah. I changed your diapers when your mother was sick in '66. It's Ruth. Sarah walked over. The old woman's eyes were sharp. They moved across the rows of tractors the way a doctor's eyes move across a patient, seeing things that weren't visible to people who didn't know what to look for. How many have you brought back so far? Working on the first one. Farmall M. Ruth nodded, walked over to the machine, reached out and tapped the engine block with her knuckle, listening to the sound the way Frank used to listen, crouched beside it, inspected the governor linkage with fingers that were gnarled with arthritis, but still knew what they were looking for. Ran her hand along the manifold, feeling for cracks. Magneto needs rewinding. You know how to do that, Sarah hesitated, then told the truth. No. Ruth stood up, her knees cracked. She put one hand on the fender to steady herself. I do. Get me a stool and your father's electrical box. They worked together until the sun went down. Ruth's hands were gnarled with arthritis, but they moved with the certainty of someone who had done this particular task 500 times before. She showed Sarah how to wind the primary coil, how to test continuity, how to set the point gap by feel when the feeler gauge gave you a number that didn't match what the engine was telling you it needed. When they were done, Ruth wiped her hands on a rag, looked at Sarah directly. I heard what Marcus said about you at the cafe. I heard what people are saying at church. I heard your brother thinks you're going to lose this farm. Sarah didn't respond. She was testing the magneto, watching the needle jump when she spun the rotor. I also heard Gerald Hartfield has you on a payment plan for James's loan. 18 months or foreclosure. Sarah looked up sharply. How did you know about that? Honey, I've lived in this county for 78 years. I know everything. Ruth paused, set down the rag, looked at Sarah with eyes that had seen a lot of years and a lot of farmers and a lot of farms lost and saved. I also know what you're trying to do with these tractors, and I'm here to tell you it'll work. How do you know? Because I did the same thing in 1958. Sarah stared. Ruth Calloway had never spoken about her past. Everyone knew she had been a mechanic, the best mechanic in 3 counties, but no one knew why she had stopped. Ruth sat down on an overturned crate. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were somewhere else. Somewhere in 1958. My husband died in 57. Heart attack. 38 years old. Left me with a 100-acre farm, 2 children, under 10, and a loan from the farmer's bank that I couldn't service. The bank gave me 2 years. Ruth's hands were in her lap. She was looking at them. I didn't have $4,000. I didn't have $400. What I had was a barn full of tools and a reputation for being able to fix anything with a motor. She looked up at Sarah. So I started buying broken equipment at auctions, manure spreaders, hay balers, cultivators, things farmers needed but couldn't afford new. I'd fix them in my barn and sell them for half what the dealerships charged. Ruth's voice was flat, factual, reciting history without emotion. People laughed at me. A woman working on machinery. Samuel Brennan told people I didn't know a crankshaft from a camshaft. Said I was going to get myself killed working under equipment I didn't understand. Said women didn't have the upper body strength for mechanical work. Did you save the farm? Ruth looked at Sarah. I paid off that loan in 23 months. I kept farming until my boys were old enough to take over. And every piece of equipment I sold is still working somewhere in this county, or was last I heard. She stood up, knees cracked, steadied herself on the farmall's fender. Sarah, these men who are laughing at you don't understand what you understand. They think equipment is something you buy. You and I know it's something you maintain. That's not a small difference. That's everything. Will you help me? Ruth picked up her jacket, pulled it on slowly, favoring her left shoulder. I didn't drive out here to look at the scenery. I'll be back Saturday. Have the second one pulled in and the head off. Ruth left. Sarah stood in the shop and watched the old woman's truck disappear down the county road. Then she turned back to the Farmall M and finished the rebuild. New radiator hoses and a thermostat, $18. A rebuilt carburetor kit, $14. Sarah went through the carburetor on the workbench, cleaning every passage, replacing every gasket, setting the float height with the kind of precision that comes from doing something dozens of times. While she was working, she opened the top drawer of her father's workbench, looking for a gasket scraper. Inside, beneath a tray of assorted bolts, she found the notebook. Oil-stained cover, yellowed pages, Frank's handwriting, cramped, imprecise, functional. Repair log, dates, machines, problems, solutions, costs, entries going back to 1959. Sarah turned the pages slowly, found entries for the family Farmall H, entries for neighbors' machines Frank had fixed as favors, entries for equipment that had passed through the shop over 20 years. On a page near the back, in slightly larger letters than the rest, a single sentence that was not a repair note at all. Don't count what you've spent. Count what you saved someone else from spending. Sarah closed the notebook, set it on the bench beside the disassembled carburetor, looked at it for a while. Her father's handwriting, his philosophy, his answer to the question Sarah had been asking herself. She finished the carburetor, installed it on the rebuilt engine, filled the cooling system, checked the oil, primed the fuel line, turned the key. The Farmall M started on the third crank. The exhaust coughed twice, cleared, settled into the deep rhythmic idle that flathead four-cylinder engines have been making since 1939. The sound filled the shop. Sarah stood beside the machine with her hand on the hood, felt the vibration travel through the steel and into her palm and up her arm. And for a moment, standing in her father's shop with her father's tools on the bench and her father's words in a notebook 6 inches from her elbow, the distance between 1983 and 1959 was not very far at all. Total parts cost for the first Farmall M rebuild $119. The machine had taken Sarah 22 working evenings across 6 weeks. 1 week after the rebuild, a brown pickup truck Sarah didn't recognize pulled into her driveway. The driver was young, 24 years old, thin in the way young men are thin when they're working hard and eating carefully. His name was Tyler Jameson. Tyler's mother had lost their 160-acre farm to foreclosure 6 months earlier. Tyler had watched men from Regional Farm Credit load his mother's equipment onto trucks and haul it away. He had stood in the yard and watched them drive off, and known that he was watching the end of something that had started with his great-grandfather in 1891. After the foreclosure, Tyler's mother had moved to Waterloo to live with her sister. Tyler had stayed, signed a lease on 120 acres of ground 3 miles north of Waverly. The lease was cheap because the land was rough, creek bottom, prone to flooding, the kind of ground that would make decent hay but would never make great corn. Tyler was trying to figure out how to farm it with no equipment, no credit, and no collateral that any bank in Bremer County would accept. He had applied for equipment loans at 3 banks. All 3 had said no. He was 24 years old with no credit history and no assets and a lease on marginal ground. The banks saw risk. Tyler saw his last chance. He had heard about Sarah's tractors from someone at the co-op, heard that there was a woman east of Waverly buying old equipment and fixing it up, heard that she might be selling it cheap. He didn't know if it was true, but he drove out to see. He stood at the edge of the rows and looked at them the way a thirsty man looks at a well he's not sure is functional. Mrs. Mitchell. Sarah was under the hood of the second Farmall M. She straightened up, looked at the young man standing in her yard. She recognized him. She had known his mother, Patricia Jameson, had attended the foreclosure auction where Patricia's equipment had been sold. "What can I do for you, Tyler?" Tyler blinked. "You know my name. I knew your mother. I'm sorry about the farm." Tyler looked down, hands in his pockets, shoulders tight. "Thank you." He gestured at the rows of tractors. "I heard you might be selling some of these." "Might be. What do you need?" "Something I can afford without borrowing." Sarah wiped her hands on a rag. The Farmall M was in the shop behind her, red paint fresh, engine tested, hydraulics working. She'd been planning to advertise it at the co-op next week. See what offers came in. Try to get 12 or 1300 if she could. She looked at Tyler Jameson standing in her yard. 24 years old, last chance, no equipment, no credit. She made a decision. Come here. She led Tyler into the shop, showed him the Farmall M, walked him around it, showed him the engine, pulled the dipstick, showed him the clean oil, opened the radiator, showed him the fresh coolant, started the engine, let him hear it idle. Tyler stood beside the machine and listened. His face was doing something Sarah recognized. Relief, recognition, hope. How much? Sarah had done the arithmetic. Parts cost $119. Her time was free. She could ask 1100 and make a decent margin. She looked at Tyler, saw him doing his own arithmetic, saw him calculating whether he could afford it, saw him wanting it badly enough that he would probably pay whatever she asked. $1,100. Tyler's face went pale. He pulled an envelope from his jacket. His hands were shaking slightly. That's everything I have. Sarah took the envelope. She did not count it. Then it's yours. She showed him the controls. The throttle, the choke, the PTO lever, the hydraulic controls. Tyler listened with his whole body, with the kind of attention that comes from knowing that the information you are receiving might mean the difference between success and failure. Sarah started the engine. Let Tyler feel it idle. Then Tyler climbed into the seat, put his hands on the wheel, put his feet on the clutch and brake. Sarah stood beside him, talked him through the gears: road gear for driving, third gear for heavy pulling, second gear for cultivation, first gear for when you're stuck and need torque. Tyler nodded, absorbing it, memorizing it. Then he put the Farmall in road gear and drove it out of the yard and down the county road toward his 120 leased acres. And the sound of that engine faded slowly until the only thing left was the quiet of a spring afternoon in Iowa, and the knowledge that an $1,100 tractor was about to do the work that Marcus Brennan said required a $32,000 investment. Sarah stood in the yard and watched Tyler disappear. Then she went inside. David had come out that afternoon to help paint the second Farmall. He was in the kitchen making coffee. You sold it, I sold it. For how much? 1,100. David did the arithmetic in his head. Parts cost you $119. You made negative $19 once you account for your time. Sarah poured herself coffee. I don't account for my time. Sarah, that's not how business works. No. But it's how farming works. Sarah rebuilt 3 more machines that first year: a second Farmall M, a Ford 8N, an IH Super C. She sold all 4 for a combined total of $3,700. Total parts cost $412. 28 machines remaining. But the numbers were not the point, or not the only point, because every one of those 4 sales had done something that Sarah was only beginning to understand the value of. They had kept 4 operations alive that would have died without them. The young couple in Chickasaw County would have lost their lease by fall without equipment. Margaret Sullivan would have gone back to working someone else's farm instead of her own. And Tyler Jameson. Tyler Jameson would have walked away from farming entirely and taken a job at the meatpacking plant in Waterloo. Except now he wouldn't, because he had a tractor. That was worth something, and Sarah couldn't put it on a ledger. David couldn't calculate the return on investment. But it was worth something. The year after that was harder. 1984 brought the worst drought Bremer County had seen since 1977. The corn in Sarah's fields made 68 bushels per acre against a 10-year average of 131. Net farm income dropped to barely enough to cover property taxes and seed for the following spring. Sarah and David ate carefully that winter. They didn't eat poorly. Sarah kept a garden and a chest freezer that had been full since August, but they ate with the awareness that every meal was a calculation. Sarah rebuilt 5 machines in 1984, working through the drought evenings when there was nothing to do in the fields. She sold 4 of them. Total revenue $4,600. Parts cost $527. 23 machines remaining. Then November came, and with it the Oliver 88. Sarah pulled it into the shop on a cold evening when the first snow was starting to fall. A customer had already put down a deposit. Ryan Hartwell, 22 years old, $200 deposit, deadline Christmas. The first 2 weeks went like every other rebuild. Unseize the engine. Success. New rings and bearings. Success. Magneto rebuild. Success. Week 3. Sarah was doing final assembly. She filled the cooling system, checked for leaks. Water came out. Not from a hose, not from a gasket, from inside the block itself. A crack in the cylinder wall, internal, invisible during disassembly. The kind of failure that only reveals itself when you think you're done. Ruth came out to look at it, knelt beside the engine for 20 minutes, inspecting, tapping, finally stood up, knees cracked. Crack this deep, this placement. Can't weld it, Sarah. I have to try. Sarah tried. 3 times she welded that crack. 3 times it opened again. JB weld failed. Attempt to sleeve the cylinder failed. Friday night, December 13th, 1984, 10 o'clock. Sarah sat alone in the shop. The Oliver 88 would not run. Christmas was 12 days away. Ryan Hartwell needed that machine for spring planting. Sarah had taken the man's deposit and made a promise. And for the first time since she had raised her hand at the auction, Sarah stopped. She did not cry. She just sat on the stool with her hands covering her face and her shoulders carrying a weight that had finally become too much. The shop was cold. The wood stove had gone out. The wind was picking up outside. Sarah sat on the stool and thought about all the things she had been trying not to think about. The loan payment due in 8 days, she had it, barely. The remaining machines, 23 of them still sitting outside. Emma, 19 years old, angry, ashamed. Sarah hadn't spoken to her daughter in 3 months. Gerald Hartfield, 18 months before foreclosure. It had been 20 months now. Sarah sat on the stool and faced the possibility that Marcus Brennan had been right, that David had been right, that Emma had been right. Then the shop door opened. David, her brother, standing in the doorway with snow on his shoulders. He didn't say anything. He just walked over and sat down on the floor beside the stool, put his hand on her shoulder, waited. 20 minutes passed. Finally, Sarah spoke. Her voice came out rough. I can't fix it. I know. I told that boy I'd have it ready by Christmas. I know. I took his money, David. $200. David didn't respond immediately. Then he said what Sarah needed to hear. So give it back, with interest, and sell him something else. Sarah lifted her head, looked at the Oliver. I failed. No, the engine failed. You did everything right. Sometimes things are broken in ways you can't see until it's too late. That's not failure. You want to quit? Sarah's voice was barely audible. Do you think I should go? But I'll support you if you need to. Sarah stood up slowly. Her back hurt. Her shoulders hurt. Her hands were cracked along every knuckle. She walked over to the phone on the shop wall, called Ryan Hartwell. The conversation was short. I can't fix the Oliver. The block's cracked, too deep to weld. I'm returning your deposit plus $100 for making you wait. Ryan was quiet for a moment. You have another one I do. Ford 9N, $600. I'll take it. Sarah hung up, looked at David. He was still sitting on the floor. He smiled at her. See, not failure, just adjustment. Saturday morning, Sarah stripped the Oliver 88 for parts. Everything salvageable went into inventory. The block went to the scrapyard for $40. Net loss on the Oliver $360. But Sarah's reputation stayed intact because she had been honest about her failure. And in Bremer County in 1984, honesty was worth more than success. Year 3, 1985, the farm crisis hit bottom. The Federal Bank of Omaha failed. Across Iowa, foreclosure auctions were running weekly in some counties. In Bremer County, 3 more families Sarah had known her entire life lost their land. All gone. Sarah rebuilt 6 machines in 1985, more than any previous year. The demand was the reason. Farmers who could not afford new equipment and could not get credit were hearing about the woman east of Waverly who sold rebuilt tractors for prices that did not require a loan. Sarah sold all 6. Total revenue $6,200. 17 machines remaining. Something else happened in 1985. Tyler Jameson, farming his 120 leased acres with the Farmall M he had bought from Sarah 2 years earlier, made his lease payment in full and on time. His landlord renewed the lease for another 3 years. Tyler was the only young farmer in Bremer County that year who was current on every obligation. The Farmall M had not missed a day of work. Marcus Brennan started driving past Sarah's farm. April of 1985, he drove past and saw Sarah's rows getting shorter. July, he drove past again, slowed down, stopped on the shoulder, watched Sarah working on an Alice Chalmers. Marcus did not go in. He drove away. And at night in his office above the showroom, he sat alone with the ledgers open and tried to find a version of the math that did not end with him losing everything. There was no such version. His dealership was bleeding. Repossessed machines crowded his lot. Floor plan financing was killing him. 12 of his customers defaulted in the spring of 1985. 12 families. Gone. And every one of them was a reminder that Marcus had sold them the debt that killed them. His mother spoke to him one evening in September. Patricia Brennan, 71 years old. Do you remember 1956? Marcus looked up from the papers. Remember what? Frank Mitchell fixed your father's tractor. Free. We were broke. Marcus didn't say anything. Sarah Mitchell is Frank's daughter. Patricia left the room, but the seed was planted. On a Friday morning in October of 1986, Marcus Brennan's equipment dealership was closing. The liquidation auction was scheduled for 10 o'clock. The lot held 14 unsold tractors, brand new, factory paint, a John Deere 4.4 $38,000, a Case IH 5940, $41,000. Machines sitting in neat rows behind a building that would be empty by Christmas. Marcus was there. He stood at the far edge of the lot near the service bay doors. His face was composed. His posture was straight. Then the sound came from the county road, a deep rhythmic chuffing, the unmistakable exhaust note of a flathead 4-cylinder engine. Several men in the parking lot turned toward the road. Then the Farmall M crested the small rise at the entrance to Marcus's lot. Red paint, chrome exhaust stack catching the October sun. Sarah Mitchell at the wheel. Behind the Farmall on a flatbed trailer pulled by Sarah's farm truck, driven by David, sat 2 more machines, an Alice Chalmers WD 45, a Ford 8N, 3 machines from the lot of 32 that Sarah had bought for $8,700 at the Bremer County auction 3.5 years ago. Sarah was not there to bid. She was there to make 3 deliveries. Tyler Jameson was waiting at the edge of the lot, 26 years old now. Beside him stood Brandon Vickers, 30 years old, and Ryan Hartwell, 23. Sarah pulled the Farmall M onto the lot and brought it to a stop. David backed the trailer in and unloaded the other 2 machines. 3 rebuilt tractors, 3 young farmers. Sarah climbed down. She handed the keys to Ryan. David handed the keys to Brandon. Sarah shook each man's hand. She did not make a speech. She did not look at the 14 new John Deeres lined up 20 yards away. The comparison was making itself in the mind of every person watching. 14 brand new tractors, total sticker value over $400,000, unsold. 3 rebuilt tractors, sold to young farmers at prices that left them debt-free. Tyler started the Farmall M. The engine caught on the first crank. Brandon started the Alice Chalmers. Marcus Brennan stood at the edge of his own closing auction and watched Sarah Mitchell's rebuilt machines idle past the row of unsold John Deeres. He did not speak. His arms hung at his sides. But his eyes were doing something his jaw was trying to prevent, a softening around the edges. The 3 young farmers drove their tractors off the lot. The sound of their engines faded one by one. Sarah climbed into her truck. David was already in the passenger seat. Neither of them looked back. The Brennan Farm and Implement sign went dark that evening. Marcus Brennan took a job in November managing a small engine repair shop in Cedar Falls. Not selling, repairing. His hands developed calluses for the first time at age 50. Sarah continued. Years 1987 and 88 brought 4 more rebuilds. By the end of 1988, the accounting was complete. 23 machines sold, 1 kept, 4 held as loaners, 4 scrapped. 28 of 32 successfully returned to service. Total parts cost across 8 years, $14,200. David kept the ledger, 247 entries spanning 94 pages, 8,700 for the machines, 14,200 in parts. Total investment, $22,900. 23 families still on their land. By 1991, Bremer County had done its own arithmetic. Of the approximately 60 farmers who had financed new equipment through Brennan Farm and Implement 11 were still farming in 1991, 11 out of 60. Of the 23 farmers who had purchased rebuilt equipment from Sarah Mitchell, all 23 were still farming in 1991. Everyone, 23 for 23. That was the math that Marcus Brennan was carrying when he sat down on the bench outside the Waverly Feed Store on a Thursday morning in September of 1991 and found Sarah Mitchell already sitting there. They had not spoken since October of '86, 5 years. Sarah was sitting on the left side. Marcus sat down on the right, 3 feet of wooden slats between them. They sat for 2 full minutes without saying a word. Marcus spoke first. His voice was different, quieter, flatter. I spent 22 years telling farmers they needed new equipment. Sarah didn't respond. She kept looking straight ahead. Every farmer who walked into my dealership, I told them the same thing. Trade up, finance the upgrade. Marcus stopped, looked at his hands. I wrote $2.1 million in equipment loans over 22 years. You know how many of those farmers are still on their land? Sarah waited, 11 out of maybe 60. The word 11 sat in the September air between them. Marcus was quiet. Then he asked a question that Sarah understood was not really a question. How many of your customers are still farming? Sarah looked at Marcus for the first time. The man beside her was 55 years old. His hair had gone gray. His hands had the roughness of someone doing manual work. All of them, every single one. Marcus nodded. The silence returned. Sarah said it, not loudly, not with anger. The equipment was never the problem, Marcus. The debt was. 9 words. Marcus heard them, and his jaw tightened, and his eyes closed briefly. He stood up, extended his hand. Sarah shook it. Then Marcus walked to his truck and drove away. 3 years later, Gerald Hartfield came to Sarah's farm. He had retired from Regional Farm Credit. He was 62 years old. Mrs. Mitchell, may I speak with you? They sat at the kitchen table. Gerald pulled an envelope from his jacket. I came to apologize. Sarah waited. When I came here in '81, I told you that the numbers didn't work. I told you that you should sell the farm. I was wrong. He pushed the envelope towards Sarah. That's a copy of your loan history, paid in full August of '87. Not one late payment in 73 months. Sarah took the envelope. Inside was the loan history. Every payment, 73 months. At the bottom, stamped in red ink, paid in full. In the spring of 1998, a delivery truck arrived at Sarah's farm. Inside the crate was a complete set of snap-on hand tools. There was a note. These should be somewhere they're still used, unsigned. Sarah recognized the tools, Marcus's personal tools, the ones he had kept when everything else was auctioned. Sarah set them on the workbench beside her father's tools. 2 sets of tools on the same bench. 2 different philosophies. Ruth Calloway died in November of 1999 at the age of 92. Sarah spoke at the funeral. Ruth taught me that maintenance is not just what you do to machines. It's what you do for people. Emma came home in the fall of 2001, 28 years old. She had worked for an accounting firm in Des Moines for 6 years. Mom, I want to come home. To stay, to farm, to learn what you do. Sarah looked at her daughter. What about your career? I spent 6 years helping corporations minimize tax liability. I want to do something that matters. Emma stayed. She learned to rebuild engines. She opened a community workshop in Frank's shop in 2002. On Saturday mornings, young farmers came to learn. Joshua Jameson showed up on the 4th Saturday. 19 years old. He drove the same Farmall M that his father Tyler had purchased from Sarah in 1983. The machine was 20 years into its second life. Emma showed him how to adjust the valve lash. Close your eyes. Listen. The engine will tell you what it needs. On the morning of March 9, 2004, Sarah Mitchell was 72 years old. She went to the shop early, started the Farmall M, left it running, went inside the shop, lit the wood stove. She stood at the workbench. Her father's tools were in their places, Marcus's snap-on set beside them. Her father's voice came one last time. The best inheritance isn't land, Sarah. It's knowing how to take care of what you've got. Sarah sat down on the shop stool. The wood stove was ticking. The Farmall M was idling outside. She closed her eyes. Emma found her at 7:30. The shop was warm. The Farmall M was still running. Emma stood in the shop door for a long time. Then she walked outside and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full. Sarah Mitchell's funeral was held on a Saturday afternoon. The church was full. Tyler Jameson was there, 45 years old, farming 340 acres. Every piece of equipment owned outright. Brandon Vickers was there. Ryan Hartwell was there. 17 other farmers who had bought machines from Sarah were there. Marcus Brennan was there. 68 years old. He sat in the last pew, alone. He did not speak during the service. He stayed for the reception, shook Emma's hand and held it for a long time. Your mother was right. Then he left. Emma lived in the farmhouse and continued the workshop. David kept the farm running until 2010. Then Emma took over. The 180 acres that Frank Mitchell had worked, that Sarah had saved, that Emma now maintained. Today, a new John Deere 8R Series tractor costs $350,000. A young farmer starting out faces the same choice Sarah's neighbors faced in '83. Finance the new machine and carry the debt, or find another way. Manufacturers today use software locks to prevent farmers from repairing their own equipment. In Sarah's time, the lock was financial. Today, it is digital. The principle is the same. Dependency is profitable for the people selling it. Independence is not. The shop Frank Mitchell built in 1958 is still standing. Emma runs the community workshop from it every Saturday. Young farmers sit on the same stools and learn the same lesson that has been taught in that room since '58. That a machine will tell you what it needs if you are willing to close your eyes and listen. On the wall above the workbench in Sarah's handwriting is a single sentence. Every broken machine is just a conversation you haven't finished yet. Her father wrote it first. Sarah found it. Emma framed it. And on Saturday mornings in Waverly, Iowa, in a shop that smells like diesel and old iron and oak smoke from a wood stove that has been warming the same room for more than 60 years, the conversation continues. The lesson is not complicated. A $119 rebuild kept a family on their land. A $32,000 loan took one off it. Maintenance costs less than payments. Knowledge weighs less than debt. An old machine you understand is worth more than a new machine that owns you. Don't laugh at what you don't understand. Don't bet against a quiet woman with her father's tools, and don't ever confuse the price of something with what it's worth.